So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sabina Vaught. Welcome to this two-part event. We're going to start with a conversational book talk with authors, followed by a participatory conversation with you all with authors on ethnographic methodologies. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Practices of Freedom Grant Project, the Commons for Critical Pedagogy and Leadership, and the Center for Urban Education. Many, many thank yous to Dr. Elon Dancy, Executive Director of the Center for Urban Education, and Emily Conklin, CUE's Center Administrator, and the leadership team of the Practices of Freedom Project, including Christy McGuire, Martez Files, and Chris Wright. Today's event is not a webinar. Don't be scared. We made this decision because for the second half of this convening, we want to make sure that you all can just be in direct conversation with Ujju and Stacey. So for the first part, I'll be asking them questions. You can send questions to me directly in the chat prior to the more conversational part with you all. And I'll let you know when we're shifting in to open up for collective conversation, and I'll remind you, but we'll use the hand raise and chat functions for that portion. I am really excited to be able to welcome and introduce Stacey J. Lee. Stacey is VLAS Research Professor and Frederick Erickson Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation Professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and a faculty affiliate in Asian American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An ethnographer, her work examines the racialization of Asian American youth in U.S. schools. She is the author of the books Unraveling the Model Minority Stereotype, Listening to Asian American Youth, Up Against Whiteness, Race School, and Immigrant Youth, and the book she'll talk about with us today, Resisting Asian American Invisibility. Among many other accolades, Stacey has received the American Educational Studies Association Lifetime Achievement Award and the American Anthropological Association's George and Louise Spindler Award. And I was sharing with her earlier that there's a piece of her bio oddly missing from her official website, and that is that she was my doctoral advisor. So I'm adding that in, and hopefully it'll make it to the website soon. Thanks for being with us, Stacey.
Thank you. And I should add all the names of all of my wonderful former advisees, right? Like that's the best work ever. Yeah.
Ujju Aggarwal is trained as a community organizer, popular educator, and cultural anthropologist. She's currently an assistant professor of anthropology and experiential learning in the bachelor's program for adult and transfer students at the New School. At the New School, she also coordinates the self-directed learning program. Her first book, which she'll be talking about with us today, is Unsettling Choice, Race, Rights, and the Partitioning of Public Education. Ujju also brings a long history working to build organizing for educational justice, immigrants' rights, and abolition, as well as projects at the intersection of arts and social justice, popular education, and adult literacy. She currently serves on the board of Teachers Unite, on the advisory board of the Parent Leadership Project at the Bloomingdale Family Head Start Center, the Participatory Action Research Center for Education, and is a member of Insight Palestine Force. Welcome, Ujju. We're so happy you're here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lena.
So we're going to start, as I mentioned, with a general book conversation, and I'll jump right in. Many of us on this call have really been thinking about scholarship living in the questions. And so I'd like to pose to you a question, and that is, what are the questions that are at the heart of your respective books? And what sort of inspired or catalyzed the questions that are at the heart of your books? And maybe Stacey, if you would start us off.
So I want to start by simply saying that this book project and all of the questions that grew out of it and what we did came out of a collaborative project, a team ethnography that I did with 3 of my graduate students, 2 of whom have gone on and have since finished. They are Linda Feng, who's now an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Jua Zhang, who's now an assistant professor at UW Oshkosh, and Mai-Neng Wang, who is finishing up her dissertation now. So this started as a conversation in my office one day. And I was lucky enough to, I won a mid-career award and didn't know what to do with the money. And they happened to be in my office. And I'm like, I have this money. I don't know what to do with it. I was working on other things. And they said, well, why don't you do a follow-up to Up Against Whiteness, which was a book that I had written 10 years before this conversation. And I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah, we would do it with you. And I'm like, really? And so it just literally just started as one of those, like, we're hanging out in my office and we're talking, right? And so Up Against Whiteness was an ethnography that I conducted back in like 99, 2000. The book came out in 2005. It was an ethnography of a high school that I call University Heights High that focused on Hmong youth. And so it might be important to say that Jua and Mai-Neng are both Hmong women. Linda identifies as Khmer. And so as 3 Southeast Asian American women who were all in grad school at the same time and hanging out in my office a lot, they were like, hey, there's still not that much work on Southeast Asian American youth. I think there's something with the group, we can all do together, right? And we started meeting regularly and talking about what that project would look like. And it grew into what we ended up doing, which was a multi-sided ethnography. I know that we're not supposed to talk about that yet, so I'll try not to say too much, but it was a multi-sided ethnography. I'll just skip ahead because otherwise I'll just go down where I really want to talk, which is the kind of team part of the work. But as far as the answer to your question about the focus of the book and the questions, we started focusing on this idea of invisibility and hypervisibility because it actually came from our participants, right? We were in 3 different sites spending time with Hmong folks, adults and young people. And we were really interested from them in finding out what they thought was going on in their communities and what concerns they had. And so we didn't, other than saying the location and and needing to focus some on young people, we really didn't predetermine the questions or the topics. We really wanted to know from the community, what are your concerns? What are you experiencing? What are you doing, right? And one of the first things that really emerged and just kept coming up was this concern around invisibility, right? Folks just kept saying, people don't know who Hmong people are, and they think we're Chinese. We heard that a lot, or some version of that. So we started, and then a few people said, and when they do know who we are, it's only from this really like problematic kind of perspective. So we started sort of thinking about kind of issues of recognition and misrecognition. So the questions that basically ended up driving the study were kind of how are Hmong youth rendered invisible or hypervisible in schools and communities by both discourses around race, but also by educational policies. And then the second sort of big question that we were asking were, how are Hmong American communities challenging their invisibility, right? Because it became very, very clear that while they faced incredible barriers and inequalities, they were not passively sitting back, right? They were actively engaging in resistance and trying to reframe the narrative around who they are. So I think the next part of your question is, yeah, I think maybe I answered your question. So this is all related to kind of my ongoing interest in the racialization of Asian Americans and my ongoing interest in looking inside groups to help, lift up diversity within the community. One of the things we did find was that there's quite a lot of diversity within the community in terms of their strategies for resistance, right? So everybody identified a common problem. Everybody was really actively resisting, but there wasn't one solution they were putting forward. There were multiple, debates within the community, and I was really interested in that as well. So I can stop there.
Go
And-
ahead. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for that, Stacey, and really honored also to be in conversation with you. And yeah, so I guess for me, I'll begin by saying the questions that are at the heart of my research grow out of over 2 decades of work in a neighborhood that some people call Manhattan Valley here in New York City, where for many years I worked as a popular educator in a membership-based organization of poor and working class adult immigrant women of color called the Center for Immigrant Families, that later, years later, kind of became a different iteration of organizing called the Parent Leadership Project that I continue to stay involved in. And I share this because beyond being beyond context, it's really been foundational. That work was really foundational to my own intellectual development, how I learned in spaces of organizing with and from others to think dialectically about power, to consider contradiction as a generative space for organizing and also research, and to also listen, to also learn to really listen and look for deep knowledge that already exists, the epistemology and frameworks that are not only forms of knowing, but also key insights about how power works, and spaces of kind of the construction of generative questions as well. So building from these spaces of collective learning and also reflecting on some of the contradictions that we confronted in our organizing, which came to focus on the intersection of public schools and gentrification in this neighborhood. Some of the key questions of my book focuses on what can thinking through choice, writ broadly, help us map and illuminate about not only how to better manage or understand choice, make it more equitable, but really how to think more capaciously about neoliberalism. From a framework that pushes us beyond a formulaic understanding that locates the state simply as the administrator of privatization, to include also then spaces of the public, and to think more critically about the structure of rights that we have, the public that we have, as well as the nature of the ways that choice and neoliberalism more broadly shapes a pervasive cultural logic that impacts all aspects of our lives, including even how we think about ideas of community and care often. And so thinking through choice like this requires us also, when I try to show, to think about a perspective that really emphasizes unfinished struggles for justice, and considering then from that perspective, what schools represent and what they've represented in the course and space of freedom struggles in particular, and then how it came to be, how our rights and our schools are structured as such, right? And how attending to these questions then is a kind of both a methodological and theoretical approach to tracing struggle in order to locate our present differently, right? To help us think about where we are in our present differently, and how we also map then and consider the production of place and the continued production of racial geographies. So one of the key contradictions that we came up against in our organizing and that I continue to follow in my research in this book is, what does it mean to really fight to preserve and defend a state institution like public schools, which Sabina, as you and others show us, are not outside of the carceral state, but deeply embedded within it, right? And what does it mean to fight for and through these institutions? And relatedly, then, how do we understand questions of rights and democracy, and from whose vantage point, right? Kind of from which historical subject? And how does that again shift how we understand either the erosion of a democracy or a democracy that never has been necessarily, right? And then yeah, within there, just to wrap up, I think thinking then about what is being fought for when people struggle over schools in community. And how can we, in centering that question, really push beyond not only formulaic understandings of neoliberalism, but also formulaic understandings of what we're told is reformist reform, right? To really consider, again, what is being fought for, what is being built along the way, under what conditions, in what context, what forms of relationality are being forged, and how does that, how does attending to some of those questions help us consider what might be built, and also where to look for in terms of what we need to push forward.
Thank you both so much. Do you have questions for each other about your respective questions before we move forward? Can wait. I sort of do, and I know this is unfair because I sent them questions in advance and now I'm going to change up on them. But, in listening to you, I'm wondering if there are, Ujju, I was thinking in listening to you and knowing your organizing work, if there are ways in which you would change your questions given what's happened between when you first asked them or when you published and now. So things that have happened in the world or things, and I guess I'm thinking about how people on the call, particularly, we have a bunch of doc students, hey, might be thinking about the way that these questions are located in a time and a place, and then they're always revised. And so are there revisions you would make, either or both of you can answer this, or neither of you, and on what basis? Like what things in the world or your life would change how you pose the questions?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Stacey, I don't know if you have, I'll toss it back to you as I contemplate.
So I don't think I would change the question because, as I said, the questions actually came from the people, right? But what I would probably do differently now is a deeper engagement with like questions around erasure. And I mean, we started in this direction. Part of what happened was I had money and then I ran out of money. And when I ran out of money, folks were still really invested, but they had jobs, families, their own dissertations. And so the nature of the collaboration changed. I can talk more about that later. And then it was really like, we just have to just finish this project. But during all of that mess, right, and that, we started reading more about, like, trying to make sense of, like, how come people don't know who Hmong folks are, right? Like, that's in the state of Wisconsin, we have the third largest Hmong population in the country. It hadn't been that long since the last group of Hmong refugees had been resettled in the state. And we started thinking about, like, how is it that they're rendered invisible, right? Like, and I think as we think about it more, and if we were to go back and do it again, I think I would draw more heavily on some of the insights of critical Hmong scholar Ma Vang, her work, History on the Run, like that it's actually not an accident that they've been rendered invisible, right? Like, so we don't really have, as a nation, if you will, a critical memory of the so-called Vietnam War that actually turned these people into refugees, right? Instead, we're like, who are these people? Why are they here? And it's like, well, they're here because we were there. And, this is the fact that we can't remember that. The fact that teachers were like, wait, are you studying the Burmese? And it's like, I think at first it was just, for me, just surprising, right? Like, I mean, when the Hmong community just kept saying, they don't know who we are, they don't know who we are, right? So you could answer that question and, like, oh, they're a small group, but they're like, that's not really, I mean, yeah, they are relatively a small group, but not really in Wisconsin, they're not, right? And I think this is all traced back to our it's not amnesia, because I think it's more purposeful than that, right? Like, we have erased, I mean, it was always there were always parts of the war that were secret and intended to be secret. And therefore, if we don't know who they are, there's a reason for that built into history, right? And so the questions would still be around invisibility, but I think maybe we might ask a question around kind of the kind of policies that have led to invisibility, maybe, right? Not just the education policies, which I think we do tackle, but the larger kind of political policies that have rendered these folks both turned them into refugees, but also rendered them invisible. And I think there's a question there that we didn't get to. It didn't occur to us until we didn't really have time to address it properly, and probably better not to address it than to address it poorly. So it did occur to us, but I think to answer your question, if we were to do it again and someone were to give us money, I think maybe we might trace that in more thoughtful ways, because I do think that's part of why people don't know who the Hmong are, even though we have the third largest population of Hmong folks in the country in Wisconsin. Like, I don't think it's just accidental, and I don't think it's just because they're small. I think it has to do with what brought them here and how we don't tell our history in honest ways. And so then it's not surprising that people don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stacey. And Sabina for this question. I think I had a pause on it because it was such a particular space and time through which kind of, I think, on one hand, these questions emerged. So on one hand, they were growing out of kind of this longer work that I had done with other people over a period of time. But then they really kind of hit another level in the period following the Great Recession, when a number of austerity measures were being kind of pushed forward. There was a kind of really rapid expansion of choice policies. There was kind of a few different things going on, a really rapid expansion of choice policies from the part of public school administrators and district officials in response to austerity, thinking about expanding a quote unquote parent consumer base, and a particular class of parents who had been attending private schools or planning on private schools who were reassessing their finances. And this was amidst kind of a period in which poor and working class communities of color had been fighting for decent and equitable schools. And then that fight began to look a little different and became intensified throughout the city and in this district, as well as a couple other districts throughout the city. I think if I was to think about other questions or how those questions might shift or change, I think one thing that has become really clear to me over the course of time is thinking more about kind of how and why people find place and community. And so I think, for example, there's a number of families at the Head Start Center I work with who do stay in the neighborhood because of the public and low income housing stock. But then there's some who have been like maybe pushed out to a mile or two outside of away, right? Or some people who are now residing in a different borough and who still wake up super early every day to get them and their kids and families back to that, either the center or the area. And they consider that home, right? For a lot of different reasons. And so I think thinking about that, centering that more, in terms of kind of how is it that people are kind of finding and remaking home over and over again together, and the kind of time and labor that takes, and yet How is that continually reconstructed and co-constructed? And then I think the other thing that, couple other things that I was thinking about, one has to do with, yeah, so the definition of community, and then I think also, just the longer stories of schools and community and place that that I wish in some ways so I think it all revolves around kind of this question of making place and making home, and the role of schools and community within that. So for example, some of the longer stories of fights over schools that began to kind of unearth and be told. I wish there was more kind of, I think that I would have shifted some questions around that as well. Looking back and thinking about kind of how to tell some of those longer, deeper histories of unfinished struggles over school and community and place.
Your next book. Thank you both. And sorry, had a little coughing fit, which is my Zoom nightmare, but my daughter's cat is in the house and it's just happening. But I think in some ways what you just talked about moves perfectly into the next question. And that's sort of that the ideas or arguments from your books that you want to share with people on the call today, and not necessarily the main ideas, but are there maybe even surprising sort of core arguments that emerged or unfolded that you might want to share with people on the call? And Christy, if you don't mind dropping them in again, just for people who joined us after you drop those links in the chat, that'd be fantastic. Thank you so much. So Ujju, do you want to start us on this one? We'll switch the order up a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, so I think I began to kind of talk a little bit about the context. And so one of the things I do is try and document and think through really the oftentimes colliding, divergent, and differential rights claims that were being made to public schools in this context, right? How were kind of these very distinct bodies of families of people making really different types of claims. And again, in a place where kind of the context being one in which poor and working class families remain because of the significant public and low income housing stock. And yet people didn't really ever, there were lines of partition around the neighborhood, and segregation were so deep that there were often not many places that people came together. So this was kind of in this moment, a space of really encountering one another, these unintended neighbors, so to speak, encountering one another over the shared public resource of public schools. So in mapping this, I try to, I developed a framework that I call partitioned publics, that really centers the fact that, as I was talking about earlier, public schools as one of the last remaining public infrastructures in the United States are already entrapped within neoliberal regimes that exceed privatization and ensure exclusion, even as they're couched within the language of equity, rights, diversity, and care. And so in some ways, if we map them as such, they signify a terrain that has yet to be won, really. And through partition, I try and kind of center an active and ongoing separation, one that is relational and contingent, ideological and material, and never yet quite complete, that works at scales of political and legal rights, as well as through a cultural logic, to unsettle then assumed binaries between public and private, between consumer and citizen, between the market and the state, to provide, again, a wider frame, a more capacious frame through which we can map neoliberalism. And also then trace, specifically, one of the things I try to do is trace, following the work of Sabina and others, how the post-Brown structuring of universal rights as individual private choices really embedded market logics and a consumer citizenship within the realm of the private, within the realm of the public. And as critical race studies teaches us, the structuring of rights as such, in the absence of a redistributive state, confirmed then that the expansion of rights was not contrary to the maintenance or protection of historically accumulated assets resulting from dispossession and value extraction, embedded in histories and continuities of slavery and colonialism, but rather worked in congruence with these processes, grounding us in an understanding then of racism that is not static, right? But rather recognizes how race is both mobilized and remade again and again through these processes and through the structuring then of rights to the public. So troubling what rights come to mean or came to mean in this way isn't meant to discount the significance of rights to BIPOC and other marginalized communities, but rather it's meant to emphasize that rights are often the grounds of political struggle and contestation. And this approach then examines the relationship of rights to the production of marginalization, right? Asking, what does it mean that the scale of the individual has, as Chandan Reddy and Jyoti Melamed describe it, become the, quote, moral unit of political life, right? Negating the bold and expansive visions for change that really drove movements that won these rights in the first place, right? That were about a much wider vision of change and transformation and freedom. So again, I try and think about the work that rights do through this framework of partition publics, mechanized through choice to produce a cultural logic of partition marked by consumerism, competition, and scarcity, where we're told to always expect some winners and some losers, even within the realm of the public, which presents a possibility of otherwise fostering different forms of collective life, if not radical forms of relationality, and how this logic then comes to circumscribe our social relations so that we come to see in each other only the limits to our freedom rather than the possibility of freedom.
Thank you, Ujju. Stacey, do you want to follow up with that same question?
I actually, you had me so involved in your answer that I'm like, am I supposed to speak now? So I got a little bit off my game. This is the problem with going second. What was I going to say? Okay, I'll just say this. One of the central things that we focused on was the sort of, was this idea of Asian American agency and resistance in the face of invisibility. And I think for us, one of the most important findings in response to that was that social class background and social class aspirations, as they intersected with kind of their political identities, shaped strategies in really, really divergent ways. So put differently, we had a group of middle-class professional Hmong folks who really embraced and embodied, so they embraced neoliberal logics and embodied kind of neoliberal subjectivities. And I don't mean that to sound perhaps as critical as that might come off. We really worked very hard to try to understand why they were making the decisions they were making, right? Why they were acting in the ways they were acting. It's not probably insignificant that those people were the ones identified by the dominant community in the school district as the quote unquote Hmong leaders. They were actually seen as the leaders. They actually were given the opportunity to speak for the community, even though they clearly didn't speak for all of their co-ethnics. they spoke for some, but not all. They were fighting for what we referred to as kind of a politics of inclusion in the current system. They were aware of, research by local university professors, including Gloria Ladson-Billings' work on culturally relevant pedagogy. I don't think they embraced it exactly the way Gloria would. In fact, I know they wouldn't, but they were aware of these things. They intentionally were trying to work within the system. They understood the importance of disaggregating data, which is actually something that was important for the Hmong community and did ultimately, I think even the other group recognized that there was some importance to that, but they were the ones who were like, this is how it's done. Here's the language. Here are the kinds of arguments we can make with data. So they were pretty sophisticated, if you will, in not being critical of neoliberal logics, but just saying, okay, if this is the game, we're going to play this game and we can play this game, right? And then they were very, very different from the group of folks who we referred to as Shout, folks who self-identified as an organization that served, in their language, no and low income Southeast Asian and Black communities in Lakeview. And they were also concerned about invisibility, but they weren't just concerned about the invisibility of Hmong and Southeast Asians. They were also concerned with what they felt was the invisibility or hypervisibility of the low-income Black community. And so their investments were entirely in kind of cross-racial solidarity between low-income Black folks and low-income Hmong and Southeast Asian folks. So they worked, their organizing was really, really focused on very different things. They didn't care about the achievement gap. As the leader of their organization said, yeah, it's not great that there's an achievement gap, but when people are hungry and housing insecure, we're not really worried about like test scores, right? And a huge part of their educational advocacy centered on defunding the police, getting the cops out of schools, right? So really different kinds of investments and different kinds of strategies. And what was really interesting to us was that they were not seen as a Southeast Asian or Hmong organization, even though there were two co-directors, a Black woman and a Hmong woman. So, I mean, it was intentionally a cross-racial coalition, but the organization was seen as a Black organization by the school district, right? Like it's, to which they would say, oh, right, we're not, apparently they were not the way that we interpreted it, they were not performing Asianness in a way that read for the dominant group. And so it's like, it didn't compute. And so the organization was just, seen as a Black organization when in fact it was a Southeast Asian and Black organization and had always been this cross-racial coalition. So we were, we thought as a team a lot about how to write respectfully about both perspectives. And it was complicated, I think, for us, but I think a lot of it had to do with, how each group, how they were positioned in the larger political economy, how they read the room about and what they wanted, right? And what they thought they could get, leading to really different kinds of strategies. And for us, I think one of the things that was interesting is that it once again revealed that we too often, I think, speak about communities as being more whole than they actually are, kind of monoliths. And indeed, a lot of communities are not whole in that way. There are divisions within communities. There have always been divisions within minoritized communities that are really important for us to kind of understand, right? And, I think ultimately, I think both groups were aware of the constraints of white supremacy. They were not, I think that Shout was very aware of the constraints of capitalism, whereas I think the middle class group, they would call out white supremacy, but they wanted a piece of capitalism. And they felt that their approach would get them there. And the thing is that there are ways in which people are rewarded for playing along with white supremacy, right? Like, so I think it raises really complicated questions if you are intent on being respectful to all of your participants, right? These were not like bad people. I mean, we tried very hard to sort of like, we're not trying to say we love Shout, even though I will say many of my grad students were members of Shout and had very different kind of investments with the group than we did with HIA. But I think we worked really hard to sort of say the conditions were not of their making on either side. They were both both sides trying to figure out, given the conditions not of their making, how to move forward. And sadly, sometimes, and we did not write about this, but sadly, sometimes these things actually tore apart families. And we intentionally did not write about it. It got personal sometimes in ways that we're like, whoa, we don't want to actually. But I think it raises really complex questions about resistance, you know.
Ujju, do you have a follow-up question? Anything you want to ask Stacey or?
I mean, so many. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Stacey, for what you shared. Yeah, I know we'll probably get to this in the discussion around kind of methods, but I'm looking forward to talking more with you about kind of, or hearing more about what you just were sharing around kind of this disjuncture around what people wanted, what they saw was possible, the strategies that it informed, the rewards, the supposed rewards of white supremacy, or the kind of offerings, right? That are often made to some, and thinking about kind of, how you understood that being navigated, negotiated by people, as well as kind of then the intercommunity and intra-community kind of negotiations, as well as your own ethnographic negotiations within there, and spaces of really listening. I think that was one of the things that was hardest for me to learn to do. And then that's for like another story, but there's so many questions that I have. And I'm also I'm also interested in kind of how you understood kind of the dimensions of cross-racial solidarity. Kind of, was that a different racial formation? It makes me think about kind of the Black British movement and and political, would you see a possibility there of something akin to that? Or do you see distinctions? Why? And so many questions. And thank you for what you shared.
Am I supposed to answer any of
If
that?
you want to, yeah, great. Any part of it.
So on the possibilities for cross-racial solidarity that Shout was building between Hmong and Black communities in quote unquote Lakeview, I think there's so much possibility there. And I don't know how much of this has to do with the people. I mean, we didn't go down that pathway, but the kind of leadership, right? I do think leadership, we don't talk about this, but I do think leadership is important, right? Like that you have, two leaders who can really model respect for each other and how they kind of came up together in organizing. I think that's a huge part of why there's been success in this group. In other words, it's truly grassroots is part of what I'm trying to say, right? Like these are two people who respected each other. They formed this organization. They model a certain kind of like learning from each other. They bring people in. A lot of people are related to each other. They live in the same, public housing, it's like extended family, right? Like, so I don't know that there's a way to kind of, what do people say in policy, scale it up? I don't know that there's like I mean, it really, I think what made it work was that these are people who eat together and live together and learn together, right? And on the issue of living together, the sort of common thing, they often talked about the kind of cultural differences between Black folks and Hmong folks, right? Like their linguistic differences. As the kids would always point out, we eat really different food, right? Like, but the thing that the leadership often kind of pointed to was a shared experience with poverty and racialized poverty, and really trying to take the shame out of being poor, that like so many poor folks, I think in the United States, given the kind of nature of capitalism, are ashamed of being poor. And I think a lot of young folks actually internalize that. And this organization kind of intentionally kind of worked against that, like, both through like, critique of capitalism, but also just kind of joking around, right? Like, I was in the field one day and they were filling out forms to try to get financial aid to go on a trip to attend a conference for organizing, right? And without the financial aid, none of these young people would have been able to afford to go, and they had to fill out the form. And you know how bureaucratic these forms are. Like, I couldn't answer the form, right? Like, so the young people were like, "What am I supposed to put here?" And the youth worker who was leading the session was kind of laughed and said, "I just put poor." And she said, "I always just put poor." And then everybody just, it kind of broke the tension, right? Like, and and she talked about like, we're all poor, and we're poor because the conditions made us poor, not because there's something wrong with us. And and that was the thing, I think, that brought the young people were able to say, well, we speak different languages, we eat different foods, right? Like, here, we're treated differently in schools sometimes, right? But here's a common experience of poverty that they were able to kind of build on. So I think both the fact that like they had leadership who kind of built things from the ground up, but also kind of the recognition of the structural thing they shared, and the structural poverty that they shared in common, which is my way of saying this is how they did it. I don't think you can just scale this. It's not like you can just scale this up and take it somewhere else and like, here's how you do it. Like, like, but I don't think good work is ever like that. I think we're always looking for yeah, I hate that when people say this works, how do we scale it up to, I'm like, well, you start with real people and it takes effort. Like, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but, or if I just rambled, sorry.
Certainly does. Thank you. I think I do have questions around this question of scale, like I hear you 100% of being rooted in place and people and conditions through which we come to recognize each other, right? And this shared recognition that you were just describing, and shared collective definition against dominant power. But then this is with my organizing hat on, I still have dreams of then scaling it up, or like at least networking those little pockets of scales, and thinking about how do we build, right, networks that could be in dialogue, maybe if not, because I agree with you, it's not formulaic, it doesn't transplant to one community, doesn't transplant to another, but yes, thank you.
Thank you both for that.
I certainly wasn't suggesting we shouldn't dream. I was just, I think, speaking
No,
back,
I
not
didn't.
against you, but against people who think this works, we can just take it and model it everywhere. I'm like, no, like whenever we've tried that, it's ruined those programs. And
It's a problem of US-ism, I believe.
so I was speaking to that, not the, we need to dream, right? Like, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I have great questions coming in as you all are talking. So this is you're generating, I think, more excitement. So what I'm going to suggest is that we shift to talking about methodology and allow those questions to come in. And then, I had invited Stacey and Ujju to prepare or identify a passage from their books that they wanted to share with you all. So I'm hoping that there will be a place in the sort of more methodological conversation where that passage or maybe a different one might come up. And if not, we'll just make time at the end to make sure that we get to hear you read. I'd love to shift and start with Ikenna had a question, and then Anita. So Ikenna and Anita, if you're able to come onto your mics, awesome. Ikenna.
Hi.
And then folks, just use the hand raise function after Ikenna and Anita, if you would, and or send to me in the chat and I can read them out loud. So Ikenna, thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm actually calling from Nigeria because I'm at the very beginning stages of trying to do my research on an education kind of youth related nationalist program that they have here that originally started. Anyways, I'm just going to get to the question because it started as an independence project, but it also started in response to the Civil War and was also trying to silence some of the things that happened during the Civil War. So it kind of relates to my question. So I guess my question is, I'm curious about you speaking more about the specifics of your critical ethnography. What were your most useful tools when you were capturing these questions that you alluded to, the significant moments and the contradictions? And how did you, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to get more specific, but how did you make sure that you stayed critical, especially when you were working, like Stacey, you spoke about some of the Hmong who were elite or who were more aligned with the neoliberal kind of approach, but still were resisting in their own ways. I guess my question is like, how did you deal with the messiness of it all? There's infighting in these communities. There's the people who are protesting, but their parents are the ministers. Like, I don't know how to package that into a story that fits kind of and aligns with the critical ethnography that I'm trying to produce. And so I'm curious if you used any specific tools when you were dealt with some of this messiness. I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry, I kind of rambled a little bit.
I'll just start by saying we, I think, welcomed the messiness as part of what makes people human. But so, and I think the other thing that we did is that we relied on each other as a team. We came to all of, while I ended up taking the lead in the writing because as I mentioned earlier, I ran out of money and like you can't expect people to just do everything for free, right? Like when they have their own families and jobs and what have you. But analysis was always done together. When I had money, we met regularly and we would say, what's going on in the field? What do you think is going on? And we would talk about it and we would challenge each other and we would ask for like, well, you think that, but like, what's the evidence that you're bringing to bear on that, argument, right? When we ran out of money, we still did that. Only I did the writing, right? Like, so I would say like each of the three grad students took the lead or primary responsibility in each of the three field sites. And then I went to all three sites. But everybody went to every site at some point, right? Because we wanted everybody to have an understanding of each of the sites. So we were at two community-based sites led by two different community organizations and groups of Hmong leaders, broadly speaking. And then we were at a high school. And when we started pretty early on, early analysis and memoing, we would bring our work to our team meetings when we had them more often when I had money. We still had them when I ran out of money. And we'd say, this is what we think is going on. And we would talk to each other and we didn't write anything that we didn't all feel comfortable with. So some stuff just didn't get written. It was very important to us, I think, as a team, that it really was as collaborative as conditions allowed, conditions meaning economic conditions, and time. But that it was something everybody could ultimately feel okay with their name being associated with it. So we spent time talking through, like, how do we make sense of this? I think this, I think that. Well, what about this? So a lot of it was talking to each other, looking at the data, talking to each other, looking at the data. Have you read this? What this might make you think something different, so a lot of negotiation. It was part of why I think it was kind of slow. Although I'm not a really fast writer anyway, but it was slower even, it's because there's more people's perspectives to take into consideration, right? Like not just the people in my own head, but like 3 other actual people. I don't know if that begins to answer your question at all, but
No, no, it does. I think the in dialogue is very useful. Yeah.
I guess I think for me, I think yeah, I think the in dialogue is really critical. So I think one of the things that I had to really account for was the fact that so I did kind of a mapping that was very rooted with women who I talk about, like use the framework of accompaniment at a Head Start center, but then also did kind of interviews with teachers, more middle class parents as they were entering or in public schools. And one of the things that I think I had a shift in terms of my learning and thinking is that, I think as an organizer, I was very trained to have that neat packaging. You have to, right? That's your job in a way. And so part of what I had to do and learn to do was yes, identify the clear critique of choice that was very evident that had grown from kind of the collective space of folks at the Head Start Center, but then also account for the ways that people wanted choice to also work for them, and so it was definitely a both and, but they had constructed a community that was based on a lot of different principles and choice. They had a collective understanding that and critique of choice as a setup, as a false logic, as right, as wrong, as a source of harm. But then they in that structure, in that system, it was also that, of course, everybody understood that you also wanted it to work for you. So really navigating kind of how to document that, I think, was one of the challenges for me, or challenges and lessons for me methodologically. And that came out of, again, I think the space of dialogue that was constructed also at the Head Start Center and some of the groups that I co-facilitated and were really kind of grounding to the methodology.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I can go. So hi, Anita, and I'm beaming in from Minnesota. And first, I just wanted to say I'm really excited to read, Stacey, your book, especially kind of thinking about this notion of cross-racial solidarity, partly because I think, one of the things that gets erased, including, right, Asian American histories of Asian American involvement in liberation struggles, right? Like in my first year seminar, we kind of talked about ethnic studies in the 1960s and Asian American involvement. And all my students were like, what? Asian Americans were involved? I'm like, yes, right? So I kind of thinking about sort of invisibility around those particular histories of Asian Americans as well. But my question, actually, I was really intrigued by this notion that you both brought up about scaling up and thinking about how both ethnographic methods and participatory action research methods actually maybe argue against that idea, right? Because they are so deeply concerned with context. So I really love to hear just kind of how you're thinking about, rather than scaling up, right? I mean, you could have mentioned, Ujju, the notion of like networks of skills, or like how else can we think about kind of how do we learn lessons from each other in different contexts without just kind of replicating or scaling up?
Hi, Anita, by the way, it's been like ages since I've seen you.
Who's starting?
Do you want to go? Were you beginning to answer, Stacey? Oh, okay. Sure. I think it's such a good question. I mean, and behind me, you'll see a MST flag, the movement of landless people in Brazil. And to me, that's the idea of kind of scale, right? How to build to scale that is very rooted in place. Their unit is kind of the family. They build encampments. Through kind of, I think it's 20 families together. I'd have to check my numbers, but a certain number of families that come together that account for an encampment, that construct that space of co-living, as you're talking about, Stacey, in terms of your work, and living together, but reclaiming land together, and building encampments together. But it is through kind of a networked practice, and through networks of shared practice, principles, and kind of political vision, right? So I think when I talk about kind of the hope for scale, it's absolutely, Anita, as you're talking about, kind of thinking about those contradictions of, and Stacey, as you mentioned, kind of not imposing, right? But really, and I think we can think about this as it existed with the Soviets or other kinds of formulations, right? How do we think about kind of networking through intentional purpose, very local grounded work? I think that the opposite is, and knowing that it sounds like, yeah, from I think what you're sharing, Stacey, what you shared, Anita, and I think what others, what I've learned from you, Sabina, and what's grounding to my own work is yeah, there is something very particular about the significance of relationality, right, that is built in place and amongst people. And that is kind of indicative of kind of what holds a community together. It constructs a kind of collective epistemology that we can think about through PAR or other methods. But I think what's really important to that is the recognition that, yeah, we can't go and impose that somewhere else. But I think we can think about kind of, yeah, the question of network and shared political purpose and co-construction there through perhaps a different type of, maybe not vertical scale, but maybe one that is more horizontal.
So I really appreciate your answer there. And it's made me think of something that I mean, Anita, I couldn't answer the question because I thought, oh, I haven't actually thought about it. But I think the point about networks is so important. And now that you've mentioned that, right, it made me realize actually that's exactly what Shout is doing, right? So there are about 3 that I know of, significant, and there are probably more, but kind of known, sort of progressive, critical Southeast Asian organizations that they are in conversation, right? And I you know, it's not until Ujju that you started talking about the importance of network that I thought, oh, that's obviously what they're doing, right? Like we didn't study that, but that I shouldn't say obviously, but that appears to be what they're doing, right? That it's not an accident that they know each other. It's not an accident that they seek out opportunities to check in with each other and learn from each other. And that is indeed a form of not just support, which I think is important, but also trying to sort of support in order to sort of expand, right, to scale, right? And it wasn't until you asked the question that I could not answer, and then I heard the answer that I was like, oh, that is what they're doing. Like, thank you. That's somebody's project. I keep coming up with projects, and I have no time. I'm like, don't need another project right now, but that would be a great project.
Yeah, I think it could be such an exciting project. I mean, I think the only thing I forgot to mention is that, or I'd love to just kind of add on to the conversation, is I think a lot of our thinking of scale is infected by the not-for-profit, what we've come to refer to as a not-for-profit industrial complex here in the
Right.
United States. So it's a very particular form and tradition of kind of organizing, of thinking about change, about how change is made, how it's not made. And yeah, I'll leave it at there because I know that we have other questions to get to.
No,
but
I think that's it. And because of that history, I just probably, no, I know, just that scale, no, right? But actually, there is actually a meaningful way to think about authentic scaling, right? Instead of just rejecting it as something that's been imposed and just screws things up more, right? That simple rejection doesn't actually help. I was just being reactive, because there is a lot of bad scaling up, right? Like, so imposed from above. And while that's true, to simply reject the idea of expansion and dreaming to grow probably isn't the right. So, and fortunately, that's why the organizers do what they do. And I don't do that, because they're like, yeah, but we still have to try to think in our own, on our own terms, how we can, I don't know that they always use the language of scale, but how we can expand and grow, right? And support each other across space and place, right? And I think given your answer, I'm like, I think that's what they're already doing, right? Like, but it's not the language that they're using, but it is in fact what they're doing, right? Like from a grassroots, yeah. So interesting and smart. Wow. Thank you.
Couple quick things here. So someone asked about the organization, Shout. I know what it actually is. I don't know if you want me to not share it in the chat. Keep it confidential. Great. Okay. Sorry, y'all. We can't share.
For
Shout
my
is
IRB, I actually don't think the organization would care. They're quite
Yeah.
proud of what they do, and
Yeah.
it wouldn't be, let
Yeah.
me put it this way. I live in Madison.
hmm Yeah. You can find it.
You can find it.
You can
It's
find
just
it.
that per my IRB,
Yeah. It's in Madison. Super easy to find. I also think I'm hearing things that you both have, thought about and written about, and that is sort of the tension between, well, there's not a lot of tension, but the sort of counterinsurgent co-optation. So you all are talking about neoliberalism, and I think, as I understand your work too, the mechanism of neoliberalism that absorbs movements from grassroots to revolutionary in order to control them and sort of scale them in counterinsurgent ways, so in ways that sort of come back on people. So I think there's a tension there too, in what a lot of students and faculty are trying to think about, and how do we observe that or predict that or strategize around that very consistent, very powerful counterinsurgent absorption. So I'm appreciating that you all are having this conversation and thinking about it in the terms of ethnographic work. We have I think it was Gabrielle B, and then we had a hand up, Margaret. So we have 3 more questions. Jump right in.
Hi, okay. I have a very related to that question, I think. So both of you were talking a little bit about how we sort of like your questions kind of emerge from the field in different ways, but I think like particularly thinking about this piece about like being mindful of counterinsurgent absorption, either for me as a researcher or for like the field in general. I guess I was thinking about like, how do you sort of be mindful of the things that you're hearing people ask for in their work, with sort of attention to the ways that that's kind of caught in its own circumscribed space. So like in my case, I was like studying DEI. I don't know why I did this. That's yeah. So like there's like a DEI policy practice, whatever. And so like, and especially thinking about the sort of multiple levels in which that gets circumscribed, I think especially like the sort of newer like DEI being bad policy, like, or not, I'm getting nervous. This is why this is happening. It's about like the sort of way that conservatives have latched onto this language as being an important thing recently. And then like that nested within sort of a broader stuff. So that's my question. How are you sort of listening to like what is emerging from the field with sort of attention to all of these different ways in which the like language is circumscribed itself? Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Ujju, Gabrielle's my PhD student, so you should answer the question. So in fact, she just defended her dissertation proposal. So,
Oh,
right, like literally minutes before this. So, and it's on what she's describing.
wow, congratulations. That is, and yeah, we need work on that. So thank you for doing it. I mean, yeah, as you were talking, and Sabina, as you were kind of framing this question of counterinsurgency, I think one thing that came to mind is, for example, here, and Sabina, I know you, in your co-authored book, School Prison Trust, you kind of raise this critique through Jake around the question of restorative justice, right? That's so important. And so that's come up, like that's helped me kind of map a contradiction that's come up more recently here, where, yeah, restorative justice circles are being used as punitive measures against those who teach around Palestine, right? And so teachers are being forced to kind of participate in a restorative justice circle to basically not do anything but apologize, right? But the circle method is like then invoked and used. And so I think your question is such a good one around like how, and I think it is paying attention just to those spaces of contradiction that we can then kind of move in, that kind of illuminate, well, what is happening there and who else has been saying this, right? So it's nothing new, but it's also then building on this critique that particularly Black and Indigenous communities have been directing us towards for a while. And to then say like, okay, like how do we kind of map this and think about it, right? And kind of center this this set of contradictions that's emerging here very locally, but then also map it to a broader epistemology and work that people have been doing. And I think that's maybe true in the DEI kind of many contradictions that you're mapping there as well, and really important work. But that would be one thing that I would say is like, yeah, I think the counterinsurgency is kind of very quick and current, but it's also like it's not new. And so people have been mapping this for a while. And I think part of our work is to locate our present in that longer trajectory.
Okay, thanks. Did we have B? B, yes, hi.
Hello. Hi, Ujju. Hi, Stacey. Good to see you. Thank you for this. I had a methodological question, more kind of broadly about ethnographic research and how you frame it in a more liberatory, collaborative way rather than an extractive colonial framing that often gets taken, the way the research might be taken up or the way the research is done as like from an outside perspective looking in, rather than the way you're talking about it is like in community with community. Just wondering how you begin the work in terms of framing it, and then keep grounding it in your values that you're taking with you. Because I find that as a researcher, I always struggle with that role of researcher and community member maybe, and storyteller and writer, and how do you hold that responsibility of being the writer of other people's stories? I hope that makes sense.
So I'll start by saying that we were in 3 very different sites, one being a school, right? And I think at least for us, the relationships I want to be clear, we worked very hard to be respectful with each of the sites, but we spent a lot more time negotiating with the 2 community-based sites about kind of, how they felt about us being there and what they wanted from us. That was, I think we were really aware about sort of the differences in power there versus a school, which is not to say we were disrespectful of people in school. But that's much more of a bureaucratic like thing. In Shout, it was very interesting because the first time we went to meet with the Hmong leader of the organization, she very clearly turned to me and said, I get a lot of requests from the university to do work here. And I usually say no. I usually don't even take meetings. And then she turned to Jua and Mainang and said, I took the meeting because of them. And, you know, that's fair, right? Like, and she didn't know Linda either, right? Like, because Linda's not Hmong, she's Khmer, but, you know, that set the tone, right? Like, you know, she was, you know, and we talked a lot about like, well, what would you want from us if you know, and the first thing she asked for was a lot of money, a big donation. And I had to laugh because I said that I don't have. So, you know, that, you know, you'd be taking their PA position. So like, that I don't have. What other things might we, I mean, you know, we did things like buy food and supplies, but they wanted 1,000. I mean, I didn't have that, right? Like, but ultimately, I don't know if that was a test or if she really meant it, actually. I never went back to ask her, because when she said it, I kind of laughed and said, you know, if I had it, I would give it, but clearly that is not an option, but you know, what else can we do? And, I think it may have been what she wanted, but it may have also been a test. I don't know. What she wanted in addition to, or maybe more than money, or at least in addition to money, was a commitment of respect and kind of ongoing mutual dialogue. And it was very obvious to me from the various interactions that they were most comfortable with having Mainang and Jua there at first. And so they were the ones, Jua was primary there. She was there a lot at first, and then the rest of us would trickle in, and we came when it seemed like we were welcome, right? They became part of the family, right? And they became, both of them have served on the board of the organization since, right? They were asked to be on the board of the organization. Like their relationships lasted beyond what was official field time, right? And I think that's what they wanted. They wanted people they could trust who were really like in it with them, right? They also wanted us to run certain workshops for them. Like, you have certain skills, help our kids learn these skills. So help us understand the school district data on X, right? Help us understand the school district policy on Y, right? And so we did these kinds of workshops. They're like, you know, I think the director was very clear that, at least in the way that she looked at me as a third generation middle class Chinese American, is that, you know, I'm an outsider in many ways. I have limited expertise. And when that expertise could be useful to them, they were more than happy to like use that, but otherwise, you know, it's on their terms. And so that was really important for us to sort of know, you know, what do you want from us? You know, here's what we would like from you. What do you know, we would like to hear your stories. We would like to be able to spend time in your space and get to understand your concerns and your work, right? That's essentially what we wanted from them. What do you want from us? Hia wanted really different things, and I thought that was really interesting. Hia very, very quickly said yes, and were very keen on interacting with me in particular. And I think that is very telling. I think they thought perhaps I have more access to power than I do, which is not to say that I don't have relative power, but, you know, they wanted to meet the dean, right? Which I could get them in an appointment with the dean, but I can't get the dean to do anything. Like, they still would like a bilingual Hmong English certification program at the university. I think that's a legitimate thing to want. And they were smart in thinking, oh, here's a professor who might, I mean, no, I don't have that power. But as it turns out, like, they were looking for different things. They were looking for social capital, to be very transparent, right? And we were like, okay, you know, we want the same things from you that we want from Shout, which is an opportunity to hang out with you and understand your stories and your work. So
we have two more questions and we have about 8 minutes. I'm wondering if Margaret and Chris, you could ask your questions back to back, and then we can see if we can connect. And Ujju, if you wanted to pull in that last question too. So that's 3 for you. So Margaret, why don't you jump on, and then Chris, if you two are ready, and then we'll finish out with the discussion of your points.
Yeah, can y'all hear me? Yes, okay. I honestly had 2 questions, both of which were kind of answered as y'all went through the other one. So I'm just gonna try to formulate this other question as I'm thinking about it. And if it's redundant, then then just Chris has a question too. So so my question is about like obligation to participants or collaborators, which y'all both started to speak about a bit, but kind of like thinking about the power dynamics of like doing ethnography from as a university researcher, and the social capital that gives you. So my dissertation is in ethnography of a alternative school also, and I do from my own personal fund, I try to do whatever I can to like materially compensate. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that no matter what kind of like I'm gonna get a professor position, and my career and my social capital is kind of rooted in my engagement with other people's stories. So I'm just wondering how you all think about like obligation as like an ongoing thing, like beyond sort of compensation within the bounds of the project, like how you think of reciprocity and sort of dismantling hierarchical relationships as like an ongoing obligation that you have because of your position as a researcher within a university. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thanks, Margaret. Chris, do you want to jump in and share your question?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick as well. And I want to first thank you both for spending time with us. My question is for Stacey, and it's stemming from a question that he kind of asked. So you kind of already engaged it, but it was about the sort of differing politics between the groups that you were in dialogue with. And a word that kept surfacing for me is objective. And it's like this sort of term that I initially learned I was supposed to be doing in some of my more liberal university classes. And then I, take classes and I'm in sessions with Sabina and Nancy. And that word is completely, thrown into question, needs to be thrown away, right? That it's impossible. And so I guess I'm wondering how it is you wrestle with that. Because I'm thinking, for me, Shout's politics are so much more in alignment with the type of sort of world that I want to see. And I would have I just think I would struggle with that in the writing. But then a sort of following question to that, which I think I'm sort of more concerned with, is how Shout became a Black group, a Black organization, right? And for me, the question became, was that about phenotype? Like, was it about sort of Black people or Black sort of identified phenotypically people being a part of or sort of being in the community? Or was it about the politics being rendered as Black because they were sort of grassroots and communal? I'm wanting to know if you could help us locate where it is you think that move comes from, that understanding comes from.
So that's a great question. And I wish I have a hunch and but I don't have data. So we were careful not to answer because we didn't realize, this is we collected all this data and it was group and it like, field notes from everybody. And then by the time we realized, we realized early on that HIA was identified as the kind of Hmong leadership by the school district, but we didn't realize until later that they kind of assumed that Shout was a quote Black organization, even though it's quite clearly a Southeast Asian and Black organization. And in fact, they very strategically, when the youth spoke at school district meetings and things like that, they very strategically often had the Asian students, the Hmong students, do more of the speaking because they were talking about anti-Blackness and they were talking about police brutality, that this was the way that the Southeast Asian, well, as they negotiated, they realized they felt it was safer for the Southeast Asian youth to be the ones who said a lot of the things that they were saying than for the Black students to be saying it. So I mentioned that to say the face of the organization publicly was often, Black students were there, but the speakers were often Asian, and yet it wasn't considered a Southeast Asian and Black organization. It was considered a Black organization. My hunch is because I think it's both ideas about Asian racialization and ideas about Black racialization in operation, right? Like that the district didn't really like the way that the group and felt that they were behaving in ways that were quote problematic. And so that's racialized Black. Asians are meant to be model minorities, and these Asians were not behaving in those ways, so they weren't real Asian. I think if I were to write something, that's what I would write. But I didn't actually have data that I think I'm probably right, but I didn't have interview data. We didn't ask those questions. We didn't realize it until it was too late, and everybody had gone on to do other things. And so we say it, but we don't actually explain it because I'm always worried about like making claims that I can't really substantiate with some evidence. So that's my gut. But I wouldn't put it in print, right? Like, right. As far as your whole objectivity and positionality thing, I want to be clear that like here, they're more middle class, but these are not like super privileged people either, right? Like these are like newly middle class people. And so they don't have like, yeah, they have the ear of the district more than Shout. There's a relative privilege, but they're not privileged relative to many people in the larger Lakeview community. And so I want to say that as my first answer. My second is we really, really stress the importance of we would have none of these stories if they didn't talk to us. And so it's important for us, absent something really horrible, for us to be respectful of them. And it's really clear that the team also felt more sympathetic to Shout. I don't know if that comes out. I don't know. Like we just tried to be very respectful of both.
Ujju, we're at time, but if you all are willing to talk a few minutes more and people want to stay on, I do want to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I can try and be quick. But yeah, speaking to the questions around kind of that you were raising, Margaret, and hi, Margaret. I think there's, I think for me, and I think some of the questions that were raised before for me, like I was very skeptical, and still am oftentimes. No, I was very skeptical before of academics. and lots of the folks I worked with kind of practiced a form of what, you know, what we call today ethnographic refusal, and were really wary of the politics of extraction that we knew kind of happened. So I think for me, this really posed a different type of question than what did it mean to move into a position of a researcher, with kind of the questions that you're talking about, Margaret, of accountability, mutuality, and also then attending to structural power differences, right? For me, I'm not saying this is for everybody at all, but that's for me, this is one of the reasons that I decided not to kind of take a par-based approach, because it didn't feel authentic to me, knowing that I was going to then be the person getting the degree and doing some different things with the work. I know that people have found some really ethical ways to address that question through PAR. So I'm not critiquing PAR as a method, but my own decision making. And for me, then it was important to then think about a framework that I call uneven methods of how I had to figure out a methodology that would not just account for the politically contested kind of space and space of uneven power that I was researching, but actually actively engage it. And so for me, that meant really doing different, like enlivening what kind of Joel Costas Vargas terms moving from participant observation to observant participation, really understanding, building on the critiques of objectivity, that if you're just trying to observe, then you're aligned with dominant power automatically. But if you're clear that your first and foremost allegiance is to transforming that power and aligned with folks who are challenging that power, then your position becomes a little bit more clear in terms of your intention. And I really agree with so those kind of frameworks really help me kind of think through some of the contradictions that I think your question points to, Margaret, around, well, what does this mean at the end of the day? It's not just who you are in the field, but then who you are long-term to a community and a set of people and a set of commitments and relationships that you've made. And I think that's really, really, really central. And I know we're out of time, so I'll leave it there. But just to say, yes, I think that there are ways to think about that. And I think that you're already thinking about that we can learn from. So yeah.
Thank you both so much. I feel like you shared an extraordinary amount today, and we just scratched the surface. I wish we could talk for 2 more hours because I now have the questions I want to ask. So thank you both. Thank you everyone for participating today. And please join me in thanking Ujju and Stacey.
Well,
Thank you for all the great questions. And thank you, Ujju, for the dialogue.
Yeah.
And Tina for the invitation and all of the good things.
Yeah, thank you all for joining, for your questions, Sabina for organizing this, and Stacey, it was really an honor to be in dialogue with you. Thank you.
I learned so much in hour and a half. So thank you so much.
Okay.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talk to you both soon, I hope.
Yes. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.